That's said and done. As David just mentioned, we now move on with our program, official program. As I mentioned just a short time ago, a member of our board of advisors of AFS. He is the man that's going to kick us off and provide some opening remarks, I guess, best put. AFS National Security Summit, please put your hands together, even though we probably won't be able to hear it as we continue virtually here today. Delighted to always say hello to Major General Lee Levy. Major General, great to see you. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Oh, you're welcome, Scott. It's great to be with you again, David. Thanks to you and Scott and the rest of the team for putting together what I think we're all confident will be an incredible afternoon of insights, oversights, probably some worry beads that'll get added to our collective national security list, actions, inflamed passions, and hopefully as a result of this, we as a community, as a national security community of practice, will be better off for it at the end. So thanks to you, thanks to the rest of the AFS team, and to all of the speakers and panel participants who are going to join us later in the afternoon. Thanks for giving up your time. It's a very precious commodity, and it's not lost on us that you're spending the afternoon here. I'd like to start perhaps this current state and future outlook session with just a quick headline out of the news that I think really sort of illuminates the state of play, if you will, of the supply chain for us here in the United States. And I'm reading to you from npr.org, and it's from Camilla Demonsky, and it says, shortage of computer chips forces automakers to curtail production. This is a story from just several days ago. The auto industry is grappling with a shortage of computer chips that is forcing companies to cut back production of some vehicles, with some cars already in short supply. And the CFO of General Motors has announced that they are bracing for a $2 billion loss in profit just this year alone as a result of the shortage of computer chips. So when we think about the state of the US supply chain and how resilient is it, I think that's a fairly insightful piece of headline news. Typically these days, when we think about supply chains, we tend to talk about the topic of the day, and that's PPE and vaccines and all the things that go with the dreaded pandemic, COVID-19, that has cost so many of our citizens their lives and affected so many around the world in so many terrible ways. But I would offer to you that the challenges with the United States and its supply chain far outweigh this little vignette that I offered to you by way of NPR's reporting last week. I would say that the supply chain for us, and with the framework and the lens that we look at the world through, is really the national security supply chain, right? And I would tell you that we often think of ourselves as a nation as freedom's forge. Sometimes you might have heard of us referred to as that arsenal of democracy. And that perhaps one day we were that country where we had enough domestic manufacturing and production and supply chain capability and capacity within our shoreline that we could pretty much do what we needed to do in order to respond to all sorts of national security threats. But the global and national supply chain scope has changed fundamentally since those days of World War II, when we referred to ourselves as the arsenal of democracy. And as you can see from the vignette I read, and from some of the things perhaps all of us have seen on the news with respect to COVID-19, you can see that, frankly, we've got some work to do. And today, during our afternoon together, we will talk about not only what did we learn from the COVID-19 experience, but what innovation and technology and collaboration will we see to help shore up our supply chain. And then I think you're going to have a really great conversation between Major General Chris Sharpston and Z, who will have some very insightful discussions about the national COVID-19 response, where General Sharpston was a key player in that. And then I think there'll also be a conversation about global supply chain challenges and opportunities, and then resiliency, mobility, and collaboration. So since today's theme is a bit about resiliency, the question is, how brittle is our supply chain? Do we think it's brittle? And how do we define our global supply chain that affects national security? Typically, when we think about supply chain from a DoD or national security perspective, we typically think about things like, well, what's the supply chain look like to build radars for airplanes? Or what does it look like the supply chain look like to develop and field hypersonics? Or what does the supply chain look like if we want to make stealth aircraft or modern jet engines? But I would tell you that the supply chain is far more sophisticated for that in the national security space, because that supply chain not only extends more deeply into all aspects of the DoD, but it extends to all aspects of the federal government who have an interest in national security. So you'll know that in AFS, typically we talk about things DoD related, but key to our national security is the capabilities and capacity that come to bear from things like HHS and our medical supply chains, things like DHS and the capabilities that they bring to the conversation, and some agencies like the National Geospatial Agency and the things that they bring to the conversation. So when we talk supply chain, I think it's really important for all of us to center around a common definition that's not only weapon system or platform based, but really what is it that is required to maintain an ecosystem of capabilities that our nation's leaders rely upon to be there and to be robust, and in essence, to be almost like a utility. Nobody wants to really worry about how does the power come on, or where do the wires run in your wall, or how's the grid wired, et cetera. All of us here in the central US thought about that quite a bit last week, but most people generally don't think about that, right? They want to walk into a room, they want to hit the light switch, and they want the lights to come on. And that's how our national security leaders often want to think about the supply chain. And we as thought leaders and practitioners, that's the kind of supply chain capability that we need to be delivering to them. But I would tell you, we have quite a bit of work to do. And this isn't a new set of thinking, frankly. If you look back to July of 2017, there was Executive Order 13806, which was assessing and strengthening the manufacturing and defense industrial base and supply chain resiliency. That may be the longest title of any executive order I've ever seen, but you get the point. The point was to look at the defense industrial base and the supply chain and look at how do we robust that. And it focused on a really fairly narrow slice of things that we care about inside of the DoD and national security space. But one of the things that I thought was an interesting output of that, and that has been part of the conversation subsequently, that perhaps will get teased out during later conversations today, is, okay, so we have some shortfalls, we have some requirements, but what are we as a nation willing to do about this, right? What is our federal legislative policy and executive governance, and how does that impact the supply chain, and how do we change that in order to have a more resilient supply chain that we can count on during times of duress? So I'll give you a great example. Often in the national security arena, we tune the supply chain for what I like to refer to as big E, the big letter E, and the small letter E. Often we tune it where the big letter E, represents effectiveness, and the small letter E represents efficiency. Oftentimes, I know we certainly do this quite a bit in the DoD, but across the national security space, we tune that supply chain for the small letter E. How do we be optimally efficient with the supply chain? And how do we have just enough stuff we need, because we'll go get more when we need more at the time, versus how do we be optimally effective, even though it may cost us more money? So there's this constant tension that exists in the national security supply chain arena between effectiveness and the cost that that drives, and efficiency and the savings that that can potentially wring out. I'm not sure that there is necessarily a good conversation about supply chain risk management. So if effectiveness is almost resource unconstrained and efficiency is very resource constrained, designed to wring the maximum dollars out of the supply chain, both of those are basically made out of unobtainium, right? The nation does not have enough treasure to buy everything at once, make everything at once, and have everything at once available all the time. But nor can it afford to be so optimally efficient that it imposes risk to the national security infrastructure. And that could be diplomatic risk, that could be military risk, that could be economic risk. We're not just talking planes, ships, and tanks. We're talking across the whole host of the spectrum of national security. So what's lacking in the conversation today is that pendulum swing between super efficient, super effective, super expensive, highly optimized for dollar usage, and that gray space that lies in between. And what does that mean to national security? But as importantly, between that big E and that small e, where are we willing to take risk? And do we understand what risks we are taking, and how resilient are those components that live inside of those spaces? So typically, as I said, we think of weapon systems availability. Do I have a supply chain to make a new system? Do I have a supply chain to keep a current system going? But I would also offer that in the complicated national security architecture that we have today, there are many second and third order entities that are required to be fully capable in order to make that platform capable. Buildings, utilities, IT and cyber infrastructure that has to be resilient and has to be capable. And all of those don't necessarily live where the fight is happening. And I'm not sure that our supply chains fully account for that. And we certainly haven't built that into our risk management model. Something that's really important, and we need to certainly have some meaningful conversations about, to include at the national level across the executive and legislative branches, about what should our national security supply chain policy be, how much risk are we willing to endure, and as importantly, how are we willing to incentivize businesses to participate in the national security supply chain activity when we, the US government, are sometimes not very good buyers, right? Sometimes we show up when we want a lot, and then we don't show up for a while. That's really challenging for medium and small sized businesses. What's the construct that says perhaps we should sort of flatten that curve out and provide some steady resourcing to businesses, and buy a little more predictably. So some of these businesses that make things that may not be very glamorous, like nuts, bolts, screws, O-rings, packing, gaskets, ball bearings, none of those things are very glamorous. They certainly won't make the 6 o'clock news, but I would tell you, whether you're working on an airplane, a ship, a tank, et cetera, or a launch system, the system needs what the system needs, whether it's a $300,000 circuit board or a 30-cent washer. And it's incumbent upon us as national security thought leaders to drive the conversation and drive the outcome at the national level that creates a suite of policies, both policy-wise and financial-wise, that drive the right outcomes in our supply chain. And I'm not sure that we're there yet. Typically, when we talk supply chain also, we fail to understand the interconnected nature of the supply chain. The supply chain really runs all the way from that exquisite weapon system, whether it's on orbit, whether it has wings, whether it's under the sea, but it almost doesn't even matter where it operates, all the way back to the raw materials that provide for it, whether that's rare earth metals, whether that's precision forgings, precision castings, high performance, turbine engines. It's essential that we as national security thought leaders connect the entire supply chain from the raw materials to the finished product, and then ensure that we have a connected set of policies that make sure that we can get from raw materials to that finished product and back again, so we can actually repair those things over time and have the capability we want. And I would offer to you that that's far more affordable than trying to incentivize somebody during a moment of national security crisis to try to give us the capability that we may not have at the moment. And I'm not sure that in our supply chain, we've taken advantage fully of all of the disruptive technologies that exist. Additive and advanced manufacturing. The Department of Defense is moving that direction. I don't think there's a single person on today's seminar or in our community who doesn't believe that we need to go faster. But I would also say that we need to certainly expand that, not just to the platform level, but to all the support. For example, if your building air conditioner doesn't work, but it houses the IT system that the F-35 needs to talk to in order to be able to be capable, I think that's as much of a problem as just about anything else. So it's about connecting that ecosystem of capabilities and requirements, knitting them all together, putting the right policies on top of that, and then putting the right levels of consistent funding, both at the national level and at the consumer level, I'll say Department of Defense or Air Force, Navy, what have you, as well as DHS and others in the national security space. So we get the consistent year over year behaviors we want, instead of the episodic ebbs and flows that we see. I saw a report recently that said that some 5,000 vendors have left the DoD industrial base, the defense industrial base, this year alone, for a variety of reasons. I'm sure some of it has to do with COVID and some of the impacts on the economy, but I'm also fairly confident from the report I read that some of them have just decided that doing business with the DoD and the federal government is simply just too hard. If you're a large firm, it's a little more manageable because you'll have the resources. If you're a medium and small firm, that's a problem for many of them, and many just decide to take their business into other markets. That's not a place that we can survive from. We simply have to have medium and small businesses involved every single day in the defense industrial base, in the national security industrial base, in order for us to be effective and efficient and capable and credible. Remember, our national supply chain is the underpinning of our national security as well as our economic security. The absence of that then simply invites adventurism on the part of our adversaries. And when you are in a great powers competition, that really closes the gap between the time you can sense a problem. It closes the gap between when you have the opportunity to sense a problem, I should say, and respond to a problem. That's problematic for us, I think, as a nation in the 21st century. So it's certainly an area where we need to reshore and redouble our efforts. And I could simply talk about the medical supply chain as a pretty good example. When the pandemic kicked off, N95 masks were the topic of the moment, and they still are in many cases. But it was very interesting that not only did many of us in the supply chain universe understand where those masks come from, very few people understood what precursor materials were required to make them, and how could we get a hold of those materials, and who owned those materials, or who had more preferred access to them than we did, and then how do we do that very rapidly, and then scale up manufacturing and then distribute them. And oh, by the way, what was our national level supply chain management methodology? How did we decide with any kind of insight and oversight about who should get what when in order to deliver the maximum economic effect? So if you think of this, the pandemic is a bit of a supply chain Pearl Harbor of sorts. Well, we had a bit of a sneak attack from an enemy that we sort of didn't see coming, and then we had to respond very quickly to protect the lives of our citizens. And I would say we could argue probably for quite a bit about our supply chain response might not have been as robust as perhaps it could have been. So if you just take that one example and you spread that over many, many, many layers of the defense industrial base and the national security industrial base, I think what you'll find is we all considerably have lots of room for improvement. The good news is nobody's going to be bored. The bad news is we got a ton of work, and we really need to get going because we are late to this party as a nation. And if we don't do it, nobody else is going to come in and do it for us, and we may not like the results. Then lastly, when I think about the global supply chain and what it means to have supply chain resilience here in the United States, I said a minute ago that according to one of the reports I read recently, approximately 5,000 vendors have left the national security vendor base this year alone. Well, 2020, this year alone. I think also part of our construct and our conversation needs to be around creative new models for partnerships and collaboration, public-private partnerships, dual use capabilities. How do we do that? How do we scale that? How do we have assured access to certain markets and certain products during times of duress for the nation, whether it's medical duress or military duress or diplomatic duress? That's a conversation that we don't, I think, have a very good plan for, and perhaps some of that will surface during today's session. And then the last piece I would say before I hand the microphone back to David and the team is new models for capital and investment. It's very difficult for many medium and small businesses to have access to capital and receive the kind of investment funding that they need in order to have the kinds of cash flows that they need, given that the federal government sales funnel, if you will, or flash to bang cycle tends to be fairly long. The DoD started the Trusted Capital Factory and made some small moves in that general direction, and I applaud them for that. But frankly, I think most in that space would say we've just scratched the surface and there's an incredible amount of work that's yet to be done. So new structures for financing, incentivizing, and enabling medium and small businesses, as well as new business arrangements and partnerships, whether they're private, public-private, shared resourcing, assured accessing, I think are essential. But it all starts with understanding the problem, frankly. So to everybody in the conversation today who carries this conversation forward, here's what I want you to do. I want you to look at the part of the supply chain that you interact in and day out, and ask yourself, Am I tuned for efficiency, the big letter E? Am I tuned for effectiveness? Effectiveness, the big letter E. Am I tuned for efficiency, the small letter E? And what risk am I handing to the nation? And how do I solve for that risk? Is it financing? Is it policy? Is it different contracting methodologies inside of the DoD or elsewhere in the federal government like HHS and DHS? And then how do we elevate that conversation so if I operate in the medical universe, I can connect that to the facilities universe, and I can connect that to the aerospace universe, and I can connect that to the submarine universe, et cetera. Because only when we do that will we truly be able to elevate the discussion, but also illuminate the horizontal challenges that befall all of these sectors of the market and many, many others. So I think I've given you a fair amount to think about as sort of a scene setter as we think about the rest of the day. The future outlook, as I said a while ago, you won't be bored. There's a ton of work to do here as we think about supply chain resilience and how do we take that brittle supply chain and make it far less brittle. Today, it's almost like a sheet of glass. How do we make that a lot more robust? How do we turn it into plexiglass, so to speak, so it's more resilient and more flexible and elastic when we need it, when the nation calls upon us, because the nation will call upon us, whether the adversary is medical, i.e. something like another pandemic, heaven forbid, or worse, from one of our great power competitors or some other nation or nation state or group that would wish our nation harm. Lots of work to do. Again, to David and the AFS team, great work by you. Always a joy to be with you. Many, many things left to do for all of us. I would encourage everyone here today to write down some thoughts and notes, ask questions, be engaged, be a curious listener, and remember, none of us can do this alone. We're really relying on you. So with that said, thank you for letting me be with you for a little bit today. David, thank you for your time and for your energy here. And I'll yield the microphone back to you, my friend.
Well, you're very kind, sir. Appreciate it. Appreciate your wise words and helping frame this entire discussion. It's going to be, I think that's a really great encapsulation of all the sorts of things that we care about and that we're going to be focused on today. And I appreciate the analogies, and I do think the medical situation or the pandemic is a great analogous situation that we can apply across any other challenge we have, and we're going to be focusing on that a great deal. Anyway, thanks for your leadership. Thanks for being on our advisory board and all the things that you've done for us. We really appreciate it.
Pleasure's all mine.
Thank you, sir.